So first of all, welcome. Super excited today. We have two amazing talks coming up. The first one is from Professor Alvin Roth, and he will be giving us a talk about who gets what, the new economics of matching and market design. Very interesting. We also have some books that are signed by Professor Roth that will be available as well. And also, hi, I think a lot of you know me. My name is Regina. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Topsort. And yeah, super excited for what we have today and the rest of the conference. That's it, right? Yeah, we can start. Okay, cool.
That was the best introduction I've had in a long time. Can you all hear me? I've got a mic on, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about market design because Topsort is in the midst of trying to figure out how to design the market for ads. So I wrote a book about market design some time ago, and books and markets are a little bit alike, partly because languages and markets are a little bit alike. So you can translate a book into languages, and it doesn't surprise us. There are lots of languages, but also lots of kind of markets. And markets and languages, we don't often think of them this way, but they're both human artifacts, right? I'm speaking to you in English the way I received it, but there are a lot of new words that weren't there 20 years ago about the internet and computers and AI and things like that. So we redesign the language as we need to make it do the job we want it to do, which is to allow us to talk to each other about what we want to talk about. And the same thing is true for markets. They're human artifacts. They're tools. They're tools that we design to get certain jobs done. And just as there are lots of different languages, there are lots of different kinds of markets. So often, I think, when people think about markets, and until not too long ago, even when economists thought about markets, we thought about commodity markets. But not all markets are commodity markets, and the markets you're interested in about search ads and advertising are not commodity markets. So let me start by thinking a little bit about that, how to think about markets that are or aren't commodity markets and what's the difference. Okay, so here's a picture of the New York Stock Exchange. It's a prototypical commodity market. So what does it mean that it's a commodity market? Well, first of all the things, except each security is made up of entirely fungible units. You don't care which shares of Microsoft you get. You don't care who you get them from. You don't worry whether they've been taking good care of them while they had them. And they don't worry about whether you're going to take good care of them when you have them. They don't care who you are. The only thing that matters is the price. And so you can communicate effectively with the whole market by prices, bids and asks. You can say you want to buy Microsoft shares, you want to sell them, and the job of the market is entirely to find the prices at which supply equals demand at each moment during the day for each of its securities. Right? So you're not forming relationships. There are buyers and sellers, but you don't leave together. Okay? And lots of markets are like that. There are lots of markets where you can buy what you want if you can afford it. So here are some expensive bicycles sold on University Avenue. And they're expensive, but if you want to spend $11,000 on a bike, you can walk into this shop and they'll sell it to you without worrying about who you are, without asking for your papers and whether you're a citizen or whether you can afford the bike. They'll make sure your credit card clears, right? You don't have a relationship with them until the bike breaks down, and then you might have a relationship with them. Okay? But matching markets, the markets I'm going to talk to you about today, aren't like that. Matching markets are markets where people care who they're dealing with. Okay, so in search markets, the searcher has indicated something of his intent by searching. And if you're an advertiser, you want some searchers and not others. You care who your ad is going to be shown to. So you're not interested in advertising to just anyone. You're not interested in transacting with just anyone. So prices can't do all the work. You can't just announce prices to the market. You have to try to make a match, and there have to be market institutions that help you make that match. So if this sounds a little like marriage. It is. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And matching markets are going to be markets where you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You also have to be chosen. Okay, so let's think about markets where you can't just choose what you want. So even in, well, you all have been in lots of matching markets, okay, because college admissions is a matching market. You can't just go to Stanford, you have to be admitted. And Stanford can't just decide who its students will be. Stanford has to compete with Berkeley, right? So a match has to be made before someone enrolls at an American college. And similarly for labor markets, you can't just show up for work at Topsort, you have to be hired. And Topsort can't just decide who it's hiring, they have to compete with Google. So the markets that mediate these things, college admissions and labor markets, don't just communicate by prices, they have applications and interviews and offers and acceptances. They have a lot of institutional details that have to be settled before a match is made. Okay, so labor markets and college admissions and maybe ads are not commodity markets. Okay? In particular, you know, advertisers want to find particular shoppers, and you can bring the ad to the eyeballs, but you can't make the shopper click. So you have to be, you can't just choose who you want, you also have to be chosen in order to make the transaction happen. Okay? And one of the things to keep an eye out for as I talk today is the markets I'm going to talk to you about are very different from these, but they're all computer intermediated markets. And having computers intermediate markets has really changed how the market economy works, how marketplaces work. And it changes how market designers can think about markets, because it gives us lots of constraints, but also lots of new strategies, lots of ways of doing things. So you're all familiar with matching markets of various sorts. There are dating markets, for example. Okay, and of course there were matching markets before there were dating markets, before there were computerized dating markets. You know, there are lots of traditions in which there's quite formal matchmaking of various sorts, and of course there's informal matchmaking all went on. You all look like you had parents, and so somehow they had to meet each other. And that's changed over time, and partly it's changed over time because of matchmaking devices that now appear on the internet. So here's a graph over time of how Americans answer the question, how did you meet your spouse? Okay, so it goes from 1940 to 2020, and the first thing to notice is right now, the modal answer is we met online. That's a new thing, that's quite a recent thing in American society. If you look back in 1940, you see that meeting through friends was a big deal even in 1940, as it still is today. But the other two things that are on the line there were met through family and met in primary or secondary school. Okay, and so that's just a story. It's not that people were courting each other in first grade. It's a story about mobility and about the thickness of markets. So if Americans didn't move around very much, then by the time you had a high school sweetheart, by the time you might be thinking about marriage, you'd known that you're a cohort for a long time, because they were the people who had been in first grade with you in second grade. You'd come up through all the grades together. And marrying your high school sweetheart wasn't a bad idea, because a lot of people married their high school sweethearts, and that might be the last time you would be in a thick marriage market, where there'd be lots of people who were your age and were interested in marrying someone like you, and there was someone maybe who you liked. But over time, that went way down, and it went way down because of important changes in American society, like more people going to college, which gave you another chance of women entering the labor force, you know, people moving around more. And so by the time we got very mobile, you know, think about colleagues. I've got colleagues up here. Coworkers is the green line. You know, meeting coworkers peaked around 1990 as a way to find someone to marry. And then that turns out not to be completely satisfactory, as we know through the Me Too movement and things like that. You know, so sites like these dating sites came to be important, and they are important. So So matching is important. And of course, it's also going to be important in all these other things we do, not just finding spouses. Okay, so let's think about some of the new kinds of matchmaking that we've witnessed. And let me just focus for a moment on Uber and Airbnb because of the ways they're similar and the ways they're different. Okay, so Airbnb could be invented as soon as the internet was invented, right? You could start to, it had problems to overcome, and I'll talk about them for a minute, but as soon as there was an internet, you could start advertising places to stay and people who wanted to find places to stay. You could look for them on the internet. That's not so for Uber, because Uber had to wait for GPS and smartphones, because when you want to order an Uber, you want it to come to where you are, and you're not at your desk in your office with your computer. So they depend on different technologies, and it's different matching technologies. So on the one hand, Uber needs more sophisticated technology to work than Airbnb. But it doesn't need as much information about your intentions, because everyone who calls an Uber wants to go from where he is right now to somewhere else, and all you have to ask them is, where do you want to go? So Uber, you have to know where they are, you need GPS, you need technology, but figuring out their intention is easy. Airbnb is much tougher. You can't just say, I'm in Palo Alto, I'd like to stay somewhere tonight, because we all have very different preferences about where we'd like to stay, and if you're going to stay in somebody's apartment, you'd like to see a picture and know exactly the location and maybe where it is compared to the Palo Alto Event Center. You need to know a lot of things. So Uber can do a simple match. They pretty much can guess that you want the closest car to you. There are a couple of different kinds of cars, but you want someone who will come quickly and who will take you where you want to go. And they have to find a driver who wants to do that, but it's all very simple. You don't need to tell them a lot. Whereas Airbnb, you have complicated preferences. And so ads, of course, have undergone that kind of change as search ads became possible. Because now you can think about the intention, you know something about the intention of the searcher from what they search for. I was talking to Mike the other day, and I remember when the big ad market for screens was the upfront market for television shows. And the upfront market for network television shows used to sell ads before the show was written, because people would sell the show to the network by making an episode. So I would have some show that I was trying to sell to NBC, and maybe they'd buy it. And now NBC would sell ads to you, banner ads, of course, without you knowing what kind of viewership I was going to get. So the contracts would have all sorts of contingencies. How many times your ad would be shown would depend on what the demographics of my television show turned out to be. If it was very popular, you didn't have to be shown as much in order to meet the contract. But those were very less targeted kinds of ads than you're talking about today. Okay? So lots of new kinds of matchmaking. So let's think about so there are very different kinds of markets, but I should be careful as I speak, because sometimes I'm going to say markets and sometimes I'm going to say marketplaces, and those aren't exactly the same thing. So let's think a little, so marketplaces are small parts of large economic environments, and marketplaces are what we get to design and participate in. And even though marketplaces serve very different kinds of markets, like Uber and Airbnb, there are some things that every marketplace has to accomplish to make its market successful. And one way to think about that is the marketplace has to help the market become thick. Enough people have to come to the market so you can make a lot of transactions, the ones you want. And then once you have all those transactions available, there's congestion. You have to find the ones you want, and it might be hard if there are lots of people clamoring for your attention at the same time. So you need some way of sorting through the congestion and maybe doing it quickly, because thinking about each transaction takes time. And then markets have to be trustworthy and safe. Okay, so let's think about those problems for Airbnb, just as everyone knows about Airbnb. So Airbnb started as a website in San Francisco, and one of their first acquisitions was another website in London. So all of a sudden, instead of just showing places to stay in San Francisco, they could also show places in London, and that thickened their market, and it gave them travelers from London to San Francisco and vice versa. And their competition was other websites. But as it became more and more successful, their competition today isn't, I mean, there are some other websites that do the Airbnb kind of thing, but basically their competition is Hilton hotels and large hotel companies. And hotel companies have a much easier problem dealing with a thick marketplace than Airbnb does, because hotels have centralized control over all their rooms. Okay, so supposing that wasn't the case, right? Supposing if I wanted to get a room at the Nobel Hotel in Palo Alto, when I called up and said, I'm in Palo Alto, do you have a room for me? The receptionist would say, well, which room do you want? And I'd be surprised, and I'd say, how about room 212? And they'd say, oh, so sorry, it's booked. And before I could say, don't hang up, she'd hang up. And then I'd call back and I'd say, how about room 214? Say, oh, yeah, you can have room 214 tonight. So that was Airbnb's problem. Each apartment each host might have just one apartment. So when you were trying to rent my guest house, if you applied for it and other people did, and I didn't look at it till I came home from work, I might give it to someone else, and you would now be told, sorry, my apartment wasn't available, you'd have to start over again. So before Airbnb could effectively compete with hotels, they had to solve that congestion problem. And they did it by cutting down the response time of hosts, making some of it automatic, instant booking if you have high enough reputation, that kind of thing. Moving to smartphones so that hosts could be responsive. So they did a bunch of things so you could, on the one hand, get confirmation quickly, and on the other hand, as soon as someone applies to stay in my apartment tonight, it disappears from your app. You won't, when you're looking at Airbnb in Palo Alto, you won't see the apartment that I'm prepared to rent if someone is already waiting for it. So they cut down on the congestion. And that has made them a hotel company, basically, a worldwide hotel company. And they still, of course, have a problem of trust and safety that's different than a centralized hotel that can have a security service. They have to be convinced that you won't trash the apartment. You have to be convinced that they're not axe murderers. And so reputation mechanisms have developed and things like that. But those are some of the special things that were different for internet markets than for brick and mortar markets, where some of the trust and safety, you could see if they had a big building, and that must mean that they had a steady business for a long time, things like that. Okay, so there's Airbnb. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some matching markets that I've designed, just by way of letting you know where I'm coming from. And then I'll try to stop in a time where we can have questions and answers and talk about markets more generally. Okay, so I've been involved in a couple of different labor markets. If you know someone who's graduating from medical school this year, they have a centralized clearinghouse called the National Resident Matching Program that uses an algorithm that I designed. But I'm going to talk to you just about two matching markets that are quite different from each other. Today I'm going to talk about school choice, because everyone's been to school, and I'm going to talk about kidney exchange, because it'll expand your notion of what's a market. And both of these are markets, when commodity markets communicate entirely by price, the matching markets labor markets communicate by price. When you get a job offer, it has a wage, but that's not the only thing going on, and it may not even be the most important thing. When you get a job, the first question your friends ask you isn't, what's your salary? They ask you, where are you going to work? And so you can have matching markets where money can be quite important, but the two I'm going to talk to you about, assigning children to public schools and getting kidney transplants, are both markets where we really don't let money play any important role at all. Okay, although lots of money is spent providing public schools for children and trying to provide transplants for people with kidney failure. Okay, so let me start with school choice. And remember, we have to think about thickness, congestion, and safety. And the thing about public schools is every place in the US we have mandatory schooling for children under some age, sometimes at 16. So there isn't a problem with making the market thick. Right, I'm going to tell you about New York City, where more than 1 million children go to school. It's our biggest municipal school district. They all want or need or have to go to school. There can be problems in school districts where there are different kinds of schools, problems of thickness, where there are district schools and also charter schools and also private schools. So sometimes there are congestion problems that arise, and otherwise from lack of thickness and people having multiple offers, which they can only take one of. But I'm not going to worry too much about thickness, because in New York City, I'm going to tell you about high schools. In New York City, if you're 14 years old, you must go to high school. So there's no problem generating demand. But congestion and safety were both big problems. And I'll tell you about the problems they had. But the idea of school choice is that families, parents, even high school children, have some information about which school might be good for them. And we'd like to incorporate that information into the assignment process so that if they know something important, we can at least have a chance of reflecting it. Okay. But in order to use the information they have, you have to make it safe for them to tell you their information. They have to make it safe to tell you where they want to go. And many of the legacy school systems in the United States didn't make that safe. Now, one way to make it safe is not to give anyone any choice, right? So many towns and cities in the US send children to the closest school to where they live. Okay, and that's simple enough. It moves the choice back to the real estate choice that their parents made when they buy a house. And school districts are reflected in housing prices. But in big cities, you can have more choice. And one of the reasons we want more choice is in some of our big cities, we have problems of intergenerational poverty. And so people who live in poor neighborhoods are sort of condemned to go to poor schools. I'm making a little bit of a pun here. But often, schools that serve poor children aren't either as well equipped or as well run or as good places to study as schools that serve higher socioeconomic status children. And so what you don't want is to foster intergenerational poverty. You would like people to be able to move away from bad schools and go to good schools. And that's what school choice is meant to help them do. Okay, so I'm going to tell you various cities I've worked in. I'm just going to tell you about New York and Boston. And New York, we helped them do something in 2003 that they're still doing in Boston Public Schools a little after that. Okay, so here's the New York story, the legacy story. Before Attila Khodoroglu and Patak and I helped them do something else. So they had 90,000 students entering high school each year. And each one was invited to submit a list of 5 choices, a ranked list of 5 choices. And what they did with that list of 5 choices is they Xeroxed it. And they sent it to the 5 places on the list. So that was your application to a New York City high school. So if I were a high school principal, among the things that was happening, and you can start to anticipate the problems they were having, is I would say, oh, you're applying to my high school. I'm your 4th choice. So that might influence my admission decision. Okay? And of course, what we're going to see in other ways as well is, when we get to Boston in a different way, is if a lot of schools feel that way, then you don't really have 5 choices. In the future, when your family gathers, that story will be told. Unless, of course, after your sib got a kidney, you hadn't given yours, in which case it would be a different story. So when we think about market design, we think about lots of things. And it turns out you can have non-simultaneous chains. And some of them can be very long. And they're important because some patients are very hard to match. It's hard to find them a kidney. And the way you find them a kidney is in chains. So let me explain that for a minute. What makes someone hard to match is they have a lot of antibodies to human proteins. So your immune system is designed to identify foreign objects and reject them. So if my kidney showed up in your body, there's a good chance your immune system would kill it. And the way it would kill it is by forming antibodies against it. And if you already have antibodies against some of my proteins, you can't take my kidney. So a patient is hard to match if he has a lot of antibodies. So supposing each of us in this room represents a pair with a very hard to match patient. That is, even when I show you a blood type compatible kidney, the chance is only 1 in 1,000 that you can take it. So really hard to match. So the chance that my pair can give your pair a kidney is very small because you're very highly sensitized. But the chance that we can give a kidney to someone in this big room is not so small because there's a lot of chances there. The chance that they can give us back a kidney is very small because we're highly sensitized. But the chance that they can pass it forward to someone else in the room who can pass it forward to someone else, who can pass it forward to someone else is not so small. So that's how long chains form, and that's how we take care of hard-to-match patients. And here's a visualization of the kind of data we use. This is just a picture. Each circle represents a patient-donor pair. An arrow goes from one circle to another if the kidney can go from the donor in the first pair to the patient in the second. And everyone in this picture, all the patients and all of the donors have blood type A. So there's no blood type incompatibility. But what you see is there's only a small group of patient-donor pairs that have a lot of incoming arrows. Those are the easy-to-match pairs. And the hard-to-match pairs are hard to match. And so, you know, let's see. You know, so we end up with potentially difficult integer programming problems. There are some hard instances, but so far we're always able to solve them, although the general problem is NP complete. Okay, so interesting things happen there, and some of them are helped by computerized markings. Okay, since chains are so valuable, one of the things we're now trying to do is start some chains with deceased donor kidneys. Because remember, we only do about 7,000 living donor transplants a year, but we do about 21,000 deceased donor transplants. And right now, each deceased donor kidney causes one transplant. The deceased donor has 2 kidneys. And just incidentally, I hope you're all, you know, when you got your California driver's license, I hope you made sure they put a little pink heart on it to indicate that you're a donor. Mostly we're not donors, even if we have the little pink heart on our driver's license. Fewer than 2% of people die in a way that makes their organs available. Turns out dying is very bad for your organs in general. So in order to be a deceased donor, you have to die in a hospital on a ventilator, not have had cancer. There's a list of things. So we don't have enough deceased donor organs for the people who need them. Okay, but nevertheless, instead of having each kidney cause 1 transplant, maybe we could have it cause 2. So we wrote this paper in 2016. A committee was formed. They're still meeting. But in the meantime, it turns out that the US Armed Services have different rules about donation. There's something called military share. So we've just started working with Walter Reed Military Hospital, and we've started to get about 3 or 4 kidneys per deceased donor who starts a chain of this sort. This is still very, very in progress. I just came back from talking in Italy, where they started a national program more promptly, and they're doing a good job with that. So that's something that's in the future. Okay. The other thing that's in the future is crossing borders. When you have very hard to match patients, you'd like the market to be thick. You'd like it to be worldwide. Kidney disease doesn't respect national borders, but all these kidney exchanges do, with a few exceptions. So here's Czechia. I was just in Prague 2 weeks ago. Here's Czechia and Israel. Here's Israel and the UAE. This was a hard one to arrange, not just for medical reasons, but all the recipients are mothers, and they were all sensitized to paternal antigens, so they couldn't receive a kidney from their children's father or from their children, because you get half your proteins from mom and half your proteins from dad, and after the placenta breaks, mom's immune system can build antibodies to the foreign proteins that it meets all of a sudden. So the placenta protects that, but childbirth itself is hazardous if you're going to need a kidney. So, breaking down national borders would be a good way to increase kidney transplants. We did one